Assalamualaikum, and my name is Arif Zaman. I'm with the Muslim Council of Britain, and I work with the Commonwealth Business Council, where I lead the work on women in business. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session. This is sometimes called this graveyard slot after lunch, and usually we have active exercises to get people to wake up and engage, but we don't need that with this very alert audience. So I'm sure that the topic and the speaker will keep you captivated. We have an hour, so what I propose to do is, I'm just going to introduce our speaker in a moment, and just to give you an indication, we'll have a speaker for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for Q&A. So we're a relatively small group. We have others perhaps joining us as they're finishing their lunch, but we can keep this fairly interactive, particularly in the Q&A session. So I'll just introduce Nigel briefly, and then I'll just come back and then we'll go to the Q&A. Just in terms of the work of the Commonwealth in this area, just very briefly, we're doing a lot of work in this area, and of course there are a number of Commonwealth countries within the OIC. In the area of women in business, hugely important, not just from the perspective of justice and empowerment, but also from economic growth. And there was a very important moment a few months ago when 30 ministers from 30 countries, including a number of OIC countries, came together at the Commonwealth meeting in Bangladesh in June, and a number of them were talking about the impact of women's economic empowerment on economic growth. And so we're seeing this very strong linkage, which is important. Let me stop there. Let me now turn to introduce our speaker. And I've known Nigel for some time. Nigel Denison, Director of Head of Markets and Wealth Management at the Bank of London and the Middle East, one of the leading banks in this area, someone who's been very committed to the growth of Islamic finance. And we were just saying to each other a moment ago how delighted we both were to see this conference in London at this time, highly important and highly topical. So Nigel, I'd like to welcome you here with us, and I'd like you to take the floor. Please.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome those of you who've managed to at least get this far after 3 days of conference fatigue. I know it's somewhat challenging. You're probably rather surprised to see me standing here giving this address on the topic of empowering women in business through Islamic finance. I can assure you you'll be no more surprised than I was when I was actually asked to give the address. As you can see, I'm not a woman, and probably also guess I'm not a Muslim. So I'm sure there are many people who are better qualified. But when I was asked to speak, I thought, well, what are the things I should be focusing on, given what I am, which is a director of the largest Islamic bank, fully Islamic bank in Europe. And I was also at BLME from the very beginning, so I've been all the way through the process of establishing the bank, getting it approved, and setting the whole thing up, to the point where we have now listed on the Dubai Stock Exchange. We're profitable and we're still looking towards a positive future. So I think I can claim some comments on entrepreneurship as well. Given who I am and where we are, and the fact that WEEF is in London this week, clearly I think I will approach this topic initially from a UK perspective, but then broaden it out into a more global approach, and hopefully get plenty of interaction with yourselves. Although I'm speaking and then there's Q&A, if you want to interrupt me, I'm very used to being interrupted, so please do. I should also say a vote of thanks to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who gave a speech on this topic on the first day. He not only used most of the same source material as I had, but did at least point out to everybody how important this subject is. And I think what is really key, if you look at all the IMF reports and the World Bank reports and so on, it's very clear that women in the global economy are an underutilised resource, if I may put it that way, and that raising women's participation in the labour market has a direct increase in boosting GDP, boosting economic performance, and this is a key factor going forward in terms of all the requirements for world growth. And what we'll also see is that the challenges of growth, job creation and social inclusion are all very closely linked, and if you can improve one, you'll have knock-on benefits to the other. The other point I'd like to make, as I say, is that although we tend to think of this as being more of a developing world consideration, The topic of empowering women is absolutely at the top of the UK political agenda at the moment. You may have seen in today's paper we have our first female second Secretary to the Treasury. There is much argument going on about how many women you should have in the Cabinet, because there aren't very many at the moment. And so, as I say, the empowerment of women is a hot topic right now. And another way of looking at it is, how do we narrow the gender gap? If you don't make the most of your resources, then you will see that women are lacking, and we can see a number of ways this is happening through lack of access to finance and credit. It means that female-managed firms are not succeeding as well as they could, and I'm told even that female-managed companies tend to get higher rates of financing charges. Refer you to my sources before I start being accused of making that one up. The gender gap, as I say, has changed somewhat in the UK, but it's stalled quite a lot. If any of you were in the previous session, I know some of you were, on women in business, I think things like the Project of 30, which is to try and get 30% of women on boards, is a recent initiative. And we've seen a certain amount of stalling going on in the progress that had recently been made. I think what is also important to say, though, is that we've moved on from debating whether there is an issue to debating what can be done about the issue. So, as Helen Morrissey put it, it's not about why, it's about how. And I think the thing that I would like to talk about is more focused on how can we start contributing to changes in this, rather than going into more discussion about what the challenge actually is. Because, as I say, there's plenty of statistics around that prove it, and I've just realised I haven't been putting my slides on. So I will run through them quickly, as we've got a number of people coming in late, to the point at which I've now reached, which is there. You can look at the statistics and still see there's a very long way to go. We say things are improving, but you will find that there are still only 2 FTSE chief executives. It was 4 at the beginning of the year, but 2 of them have moved on. If you look at the same statistics in the US, only 4% of S&P CEOs are female. The number of women employed in big business is nowhere close to the kind of numbers that it should be. And the question then is, how can this be addressed? And what I will talk about will come back to 2 main things, and they'll be running in parallel, really. The 2 key things will be education and training, and you can't get away from that one, and then access to finance. Let me start by talking about the UK Islamic Bank, because we are talking about empowering women through finance. And the first thing to say is that we have a very small Islamic banking community in the UK relative to the conventional banking system. There are currently 6 Islamic banks in the UK. 1 is focused on the retail market, the other 5 are wholesale banks, and the largest of those 5 is the one that I represent, Bank of London in the Middle East. But to give you some numbers and put it in context, the size of our balance sheet is just over £1 billion, the size of our capital is just over £250 million, and the size of our staff is just over 100. So the Islamic sector in the UK is both very young and not large, so when we get onto the trading issues, it's not something we can solve on our own. However, what we can do is hopefully set examples. So if we look at our own business, we have a number of ladies, I think I'm allowed to call them ladies, not women, in senior positions in the bank. And here are some examples of those. So I had private banking as a lady, I had property finance as a lady, and those of you familiar with Islamic finance will know how key the property market is to our business. And human resources as a lady, and the head of marketing communications as a lady. And although we don't yet have any ladies on the board, what it does show is that we have the next round of staff who will be coming through over time to take leadership positions in the business. And I think one of the key things here is the ability to provide role models and mentoring, and both of these have come up on a regular basis. And whilst I say, as a small business, we can't mentor the entire community, things are changing dramatically with technology, so there's more access to people through the internet world, and that also allows networking sessions to be developed and communication to be improved. I think it's also important to point out what the scale of the opportunity is here. In terms of finance, it's been quoted, I think without proof, but it's been quoted that women now control more than the total of the GDPs of India and China combined, and the wealth that we see in the Middle East now controlled by women is also running into the billions of dollars. So from a commercial perspective, not only is it right to be promoting women in the economy and so on, those that are successful will obviously benefit from it because there is the ability of women to control their own finances and to manage their own futures. I think, though, coming back to the UK, you've got to look at how the UK can contribute on the broader scale. And as I mentioned, the 6 Islamic banks are not going to do it on their own. But if you look at what the platform of London as a financial centre offers, then the impact of that can be significantly greater. You will have heard many of these statistics from a number of speakers earlier on, that we have 20 banks offering Islamic Finance, we include the Islamic windows. We have, I think, all the major law firms, or the top 25 law firms, all offer Islamic courses, the large accountancy firms do. And in particular, we have a large body of overseas students who are working in the UK, and more than half of those are women. And the key point here is that if you allow all of these ladies to be trained up, they will then go back to their countries of origin and will be able to influence those. And therefore, the UK is able to promote Islamic finance and promote empowerment on a much broader scale than you would expect simply from its position in the Islamic world. A number of courses that are offered include CSI, the Islamic Finance Qualification, which is one that we insist all our front office staff do. And I'm pleased to say that both I and our Chief Executive were amongst the first people in the UK to pass that examination. CIMA, the accounting body, also offers courses around a range of subjects, and you can get specialist capital markets courses in Sukuk, Islamic Finance and so on. So before you ask me later on, those are some of the things that are included. And we now have 16 universities and higher education entities that are offering courses in Islamic finance. So I think it's a market that is well catered for. When we look at things globally, you'll see many similar statistics. Women earn less than men, less than 30% of the labour force is female, and in particular, if you look at the GCC, there are other barriers to overcome, and there's a useful anecdote. Bill Gates was in Saudi Arabia recently, and Saudi Arabia has the ambition to be one of the top 10 countries in the world for technology. And he was asked by a member of the audience, which was segregated obviously, did he think that Saudi had the possibility of achieving that ambition? And he simply looked at the audience and said, well, if you're not going to make use of 50% of your productive resources, you've got no chance. So this brings us back to the earlier point. There is this huge opportunity. But looking at a more positive aspect for Saudi Arabia, it's also true to say that many of the fastest growing internet businesses in Saudi are run by women. And I think this brings us on to the whole technology point. When I first looked at what I was going to say this afternoon, it's nice to see a larger audience now to say it to, I thought I'd start off by Googling women entrepreneurs and see what came up. And inevitably what came up, because they love lists, is the 10 richest female entrepreneurs in the world. And although the first 3 or 4 I think were all Chinese, almost all of them were involved in the technology space. So that, I think, illustrates how much things are changing and how much technology will give people access to these opportunities. But also it allows women themselves to take control of these businesses. And technology is moving away from the limitations of both time and geography. It's the great equaliser, I was told, by people who are better at technology than me, which reminds me to move my slide on. But this is giving people access to both mentoring, to training, and indeed to allow them to develop their own businesses. So I think it's a subject that we should be hearing more of at conferences like these. If we sort of now go to the other end of the spectrum in terms of how we can promote women through finance, a topic that again will come up frequently is that of Islamic microfinance. One of the key benefits of putting more money into the hands of women is that it will have the consequence that more money will be spent on girls' education. And as we saw earlier, if you put more money into girls' education, that in turn will grow the workforce and the GDP, and more money will circulate. So it's clearly one of the best ways of promoting women through finance. There are many different examples, and you can look at them on the various links that we've put at the end as to different ways that microfinance can empower women. But it's a way of putting money out into the community. Roughly 75% of the people who benefit from microfinance are women, and so we're seeing this now fairly rapid increase in the spending power in different parts of the world. There's a number of quotations here from people who benefited and the impact it's having on their lives. I've mentioned the educational impact. There's another impact, which is that the more women are working in an economy, you'll find that more money is spent on healthcare and on children's care. You fairly quickly see infant mortality rates falling, and you'll see the general spend on better nutrition and healthcare increasing. So although this is directly relevant to what we're saying now, not only do you put more money into the female economy, you get the benefit both of education and healthcare. As I mentioned, sort of the two key themes that we're running through this are the key importance of education and access to finance. The issues between the developed world and the developing world are somewhat different. We're at different stages in our development, but in both cases there is a long way to go. And I think I'd like to finish this part with just a brief comment, or a quotation I should say, from Larry Summers, who at the time was the chief economist of the World Bank. Investment in girls' education may well be the highest return investment available in the developing world. So it's not just a matter of improving things from a moral perspective, it's financially the most sensible thing you can do. And with that, I'd like to open the floor up to some Q&A.
Great, so thanks. I mean, we have got a large audience. So my name is Zaman, and I'm chairing this session, and it's very good to see the audience sort of packed. Thank you very much, Nigel, for that very useful overview. And I think the point you made around the need to move on from talking to action, I think was echoing Nation Prime Minister's comments earlier, but also very much, I think, where the focus now is on this. Could I just kind of kick off with the first question? I think you highlighted very much the issues around access to finance. One of the areas that is clearly focus is access to finance. But I just want to draw up 2 or 3 areas of focus that not the OIC but the Commonwealth has identified in the last few months. And this has been a result of extensive consultation with a range of countries, where we feel there's a need for urgent action now in terms of women in business. And what's your thoughts on that? There's obviously a lot of talk around women in leadership and access to talent. And I think the momentum for, and we're seeing this in a number of countries in the Muslim world and also beyond, establishing databases of board-ready and board potential women. So there's actually this argument that's sometimes given, where are the women to find to fill those roles? There's obviously been some momentum in the UK, but I'm just interested in your thoughts about having something in place that enables corporates to more easily access the pipeline. The other area is the area of trade, and one of the things that we've been looking at very closely is establishing a business platform to to enable women-owned operators to run businesses to actually trade with each other. So you did talk about the role of technology. I'll be interested also in anything you may want to say in terms of actually having a trading platform that enables businesswomen from very diverse countries and backgrounds who it may be difficult for them to travel as well to actually to do trade. Particularly as we know a number of countries within the Muslim world are now service-driven, and so that's what I mentioned there. And the third thing is in terms of the access to finance. There's a lot of focus, and there can be a lot of focus on startup businesses. But I think increasingly you're seeing this across parts of the Muslim world and also elsewhere as well, in where there are significant Muslim populations, minority populations, UK, US and elsewhere. There's an increasing need for not just startup, or for businesswomen to access capital through their life journey, through the corporate life journey, or through the life cycle of their business. And it's at those points when capital is more difficult to access. So I'm just interested, you don't need to respond to all of those, on any of those you maybe pick up on, and then we can take a discussion forward.
Sure. I'm trying to count how many questions there were, and I stopped when I got to about 10. If I can maybe sort of go back to the whole education process, and if I compare what I would call our generation, our own business, of the ladies who will go on to be major players in the industry, as a couple of them in the room, I won't embarrass them by saying exactly how old they are, but let me just say that they're under 40. I'm obviously somewhat older than that. If I compare the UK student body today with when I was a student, I happen to go to Cambridge University, which I know is not typical necessarily, but when I was a student, I think there were only 3 female colleges out of nearly 20. So let's say that the female student body was 15% of the total. Now there are more than 50% of students at the university are female. So there's been a huge change in the number of women accessing education, and as has been mentioned already, more than, it's between 55 and 60% of students in the UK are female. So in terms of accessing the education and the training that's available, that I would suggest, certainly from a UK perspective, is in place. The next question though is how long does it take for the people coming out of universities to get to the point where you can say, we actually now think we've got an entirely equal opportunities employment situation, and how did we measure it? I mean, are we trying to get to 50-50, or are we going to say, no, what's important is getting to the level where everyone who chooses to get to that level has the opportunity to do so. And where I think we are is that we're certainly giving people the opportunities, we're certainly looking at the ladies we've got coming through and making sure that there'll be people, to replace them because they'll get nervous, but to come through afterwards as they develop, and as I say, roughly just under 40% of our total staff are women. But it's a thing that takes time and will take place over a period of time. What is not clear, I suppose, and I'll throw this out to the audience for opinions, is are we at the level where most things are now in place? It's just a matter of waiting because people will come through, or is there still a lot more that needs to be done? I suspect I know what you'll suggest, but what do you think?
Well, just for the record, I mean, just an observation there. Obviously, you're seeing more women going into non-traditional occupations, and that obviously part of what you're saying there. So over to you, the audience. Really, we have 30 minutes now for Q&A before we go into the next session following this. So I'll take I'll take questions one at a time. Can I just ask you in the usual way to introduce yourself, your organisation, by way of just introduction, name and organisation, and then with your questions. So anybody would like to kick off? Yes, near the back, yes, please. There's a microphone that will come to you, and then you can start. Thank you.
Hello, my name is...
Do feel free to stand up if you wish.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Aida Rashid. I'm from the United States, from California. I'm here as a MOCA fellow, part of the MOCA Fest. I wanted to talk a little bit about women in education, and specifically in the United States, there's a lot of opportunity for women education and being able to do various different types of jobs. But I'm finding that there's a tension that women have with maintaining the dignity of their families, of their children and being able to teach and making sure they're getting adequate education themselves, because of the education system is a bit skewed and not always enriching them both spiritually and educationally. And so I don't know if you could talk a little bit about the balance between fulfilling spiritual and personal obligations of being just a woman, and what that role entails, in addition to working and maintaining a business.
Is this on? Doesn't sound on to me, but I'll shout in this. Well, obviously, I'm maybe not the best qualified person to talk about being a woman and what it means in terms of choices to be made, but the topic is clearly an important one. I mean, if I put myself in the shoes of someone who is an employer in a small business, and how do you manage the balance for both the people who work for you, and clearly it's in our interest, where we've had people come through and do well, as the ones I've illustrated on one of the slides, probably about 3 behind where I got to when I was talking. We want to keep those people in the workplace, in the business. So it's very much in our interest as well to be able to do what we can to assist. Now, it's fortunate with a relatively small business we can be somewhat flexible around working hours. Certainly the ladies with children sometimes need to get away earlier. They usually will have a working partner, so it's usually the lady, if one of the kids is sick, who has to suddenly stay at home. Given that a lot of things like email are available online, you can work around that using that. I think people do have different priorities, and I'm not going to suggest what anybody's priorities might be in terms of the sort of work-life balance. As I say, the example of Helen Morrissey earlier, she's got 9 kids, but the wisdom of that is open to debate as well. But she's got a husband who stays at home, and therefore they work it out that way. And I think what she has said is very much it's about dealing with things together as a partnership with your other half and deciding how things are going to be made to work, she said. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. We've heard talk at sort of higher level around tax breaks for working women, creche availability, employees of a certain size being forced to put in childcare provision at work. There are some solutions, but I don't think any of them are necessarily going to solve all the problems for everybody. And it'll depend where you live. Do you commute to work? Are you close to work? That may vary from country to country. So there's lots of issues that are involved in that, and I think it's the key one in some sense is of keeping women in the workplace. But the problem isn't one answer.
Yes, okay. Should we like to close this line?
Thank you. I am Dr. Amini Askur, President for the Egyptian Business Women Association and the African Alliance for Women Empowerment. If we're talking about access to finance for women, and I am very much interested in small and medium enterprises, because this is the real backbone of the economy. You are here in UK. We have a project in Egypt which we call it Business Development Center and Business Incubator, specialized for helping the startups of business, training them how to write a business plan, how to write a document, visibility study, and training them to be able to lead their enterprise and have access to finance. We have a special Asian Social Development Fund which really cater for the beneficiaries of our program to give them access to finance. Your bank, and you're the head of the wealth management and markets, how many SMEs owned by women are dealing with your banks, and is there any privilege or advantage given for SMEs owned by women with reference to access to credit for your bank?
The short answer to the last question is no. We are a commercial organisation. We would have to look at every potential borrower or obligor in the same way. I couldn't give you statistics on how many of our clients are owned by women, but certainly quite a number are, particularly in the property development area. And going slightly off track from your question, as an Islamic bank with a largely Middle Eastern client base on the wealth management side, you won't be surprised to know that the sort of key asset classes, property and investment in property. But that covers a range of things from actually acquiring a property to doing up a property, redeveloping a property, and all of those, many of those interior design companies that we work with are also run by women. So there is availability of finance, but we don't actually give preference, because I don't think that would be commercially realistic.
Other questions? Yes, over here on the right-hand side. I think the microphone just heading towards you.
Thank you. My name is Rashida Hassan, and I live here in the UK, but I work for Women and Youth Empowerment Network. In recent time, we've been working on particular projects dealing with women in Poda in Nigeria, because in our research, we found out that a lot of them actually live in serious poverty. And then during our research, we actually discovered that they are really engaged in a lot of trading, because some of them engage in doing art crafts and stuff like that, and they are making, they try to live by. But the problem is, a lot of them do not have the capital, to actually advance the kind of business they are doing, and we've got quite very lucrative business from our own assessment. And we were thinking, how can we help them to access funding? And while you were talking, I came in a bit late, so at least I got the bit about the developing country, the disparity between how people access funds between the developed countries and the developing countries. How do you think we can, address this problem? Because they are there, we have quite a lot of them, and they are economically active, really. Although they are in order, they are active because they do all these small businesses. But the problem is actually getting the right kind of funding. Thank you.
Well, the lady from Coca-Cola in the session before lunch was saying something very, very similar, that their supply chain starts with the kind of ladies you're talking about, and the fact that money is getting to them is putting more money into the local communities, and obviously money then helps them to develop both their businesses and their communities. I think that, again, won't be a single answer, but the technology, microfinance, and the combination of mobile phone technology are the things that are getting finance out to the more rural areas. So I think that's probably the way you would actually do it from a delivery perspective. The harder one in many ways is, how do you know who is there, who would benefit from that finance, and who is going to provide it? And I think certainly one of the things we've seen is that relatively small amounts can go a very long way. So we've heard a number of announcements about different funds for entrepreneurs. I would have thought that kind of funding should be coming from places like the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, those kind of intergovernmental entities who are actually established to try and promote the kind of businesses you're talking about.
I think the point, just to add a comment, I think the point on procurement is very, very timely, and there has been in recent years, not just on the private sector, through organisations like WeConnect, but there are others as well, mobilising private sector demonstration of support to women's entrepreneurship in terms of placing part of their supply chain with women-owned, operated or majority-run businesses. So I think there is momentum there, but in fact the much bigger opportunity is public procurement. And I think you're seeing an increasing number of countries now looking at how they can empower women through using public procurement. And I know at the Commonwealth level there are a number of countries that are moving in that direction. So, more questions? Please, break right. Yes, please, and then we'll go to you on the way. Please, yes, sure.
You mentioned...
Should be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you do not have a special education for women in your bank to help them finance their small businesses. I would like to suggest that out of your portfolio, your debt portfolio, loan portfolio, you allocate 20% for women enterprises. I was heading a bank before, and believe you me, all those loans made up to the women, 0 NPL. I repeat, 0 NPL. So it makes commercial sense actually for you to make a special education for women enterprises. I'd like to submit my proposal.
Very kind. You chaired the last session. One of the things I was going to mention before I sat down was your video, and I couldn't remember what awesome stood for, but I'm sure you'll tell us in a minute. Well, sadly, I have to say that our experience of non-performing loans to women is not 0%, so it's not quite as comprehensive you had, although I'm not sure that the ladies concerned are necessarily Muslim. But the point I was making, not so much that there is any preference or otherwise in terms of lending to women, it's about whether we analyse the opportunities in the same way. So if we get the opportunities and they make sense, absolutely we would do them. But we don't necessarily put a certain ratio to it. But I think what we will find as we are seeing more and more women in business, and we're based in London, so you see it more there than anywhere else, is that proportion will rise naturally.
The question on the very front, who is next, and then we'll go further back. Please introduce yourself as you will ask the question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Annika Shaw, I'm from BlackRock. And just to answer your question from before when you opened up the question, why is there a lag in place of women leadership? My personal opinion is probably because I feel like you have to make a choice. Either you be successful at your job, or you have to sacrifice your family or whatever it may be. So maybe that culture of having to choose one or the other. Or as well, I had a recent conversation with a friend, and we were talking about how women naturally lack self-belief, perhaps, as to I'm not this is a massive stereotype, but in comparison to men, if there's a job opportunity, like, oh, I can do that role, it'd be more like you'd have to maybe be like, coach them, perhaps. But that's a different one. My question being, you mentioned that you're head of wealth management of an Islamic bank, not being non-Muslim. It's more of a personal question: is how are you?
How have I ended up doing what I'm doing now?
Yeah,
Culture 3 on a Friday. No, it's not Friday, it's Thursday. I sometimes ask myself the same question. My background is conventional banking, as you would expect. The bank I worked for previous to joining what was then called House of London in the Middle East, because it didn't have a banking licence, and we then had to go through the process of authorisation, which was interesting, to put it mildly, was a German bank actually that did quite a lot of business in the Middle East, and my role was to be head of sales for capital markets and treasury for Europe, North Africa and the Middle East. So I was already travelling to the Middle East on a fairly regular basis. The same bank was actually one of the pioneers in terms of conventional banks of being involved with Islamic Finance, and one of my colleagues went on to be chief executive of Gatehouse. He subsequently moved on, but the bank was doing quite a lot of Islamic Finance, and as the person responsible for distribution, I was involved in some of those deals. I didn't do them myself, but I was already familiar with Islamic Finance and familiar with the region. So when I was approached to join a project, if you like, of establishing a fully Islamic bank in the UK, I was quite well placed in terms of knowing banking, knowing a bit about Islamic finance, and knowing something of the Middle East, which I know that's not all of Islamic finance. There's a lot more than that, and particularly in Malaysia as well. A lot of things have been developed, but I was sort of reasonably well placed for that. And I suppose also to tell a story against myself, I was at a certain age and stage where I was quite keen to try something that was a bit different from working in large organisations, which I had done. When you mentioned lifestyle choices, I was getting a little tired of getting up just after 5 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and work sort of the usual long days in markets and trading floors and so on. So I now don't have to get up at 6:15, it's great. But it was absolutely the right opportunity at the right time, because having spent 25 years in conventional finance, being asked, would you like to come be involved in starting a new bank that will be in a niche position in the market, and we've got £250 million, not to spend exactly, but we've got the capital raised in a way that means we have every chance of being successful. It just all fitted together, and it was about the right time, it was about the right opportunity, it was about getting into a smaller business and being a bit more entrepreneurial, and lifestyle as well. So somebody, it might even have been you, was asking a question this morning about one of the answers in your session was, know your goals, be focused. And then somebody said, well, I don't really know what I want to be doing in 5 years or 10 years. I'm afraid I'd have to say it the other way around, which is I know my career has been one series of accidents after another. I never intended doing half the things I've ended up doing. I mean, I have a degree in French and German. I'm now doing Islamic Finance. So how do you join those two up? You can point yourself in a direction, but you'll then find that events change things. And I think where I completely agree with the lady from Coca-Cola was have an idea of where you want to go, but don't be too set in what the roadmap's going to look like, because the only thing you can be pretty certain about is that there'll be surprises along the way.
Harold Macmillan, events, dear boys, events.
Indeed, yes.
Events overtake everything. Was there a question? Two questions here. Was there a question over this one? No? Okay, we'll go to the lady very back row. The microphone just heads towards you.
My name is Sahiba. I'm from London School of Business and Finance, but I used to work in the Bank of Russia, in the largest bank of Russia, in their small and medium department. And I found an interesting thing that I just want to support that comment that it was no NPL in ladies loans, but the interesting thing that Sberbank is very it's very conservative bank, and even women has started her business own by herself, and she has her own property, so it was difficult to access the money from the bank because she has to take a guarantee from her husband or her brother or from someone else who is a male, but she's doing her business by her own. It's just for risk lower. And I found in World Bank events that in Morocco they has the same rule. So if you want to access, they will access your brother or your father in order to get a guarantee.
Sounds like, and that's increasing the risk from what you were saying earlier about getting a male guarantee.
Yes, and I think if female started her business by her own and want to give as a collateral her own property, why should we take a guarantee from? And how you will suggest to deal with that in order to get an access to money?
Yeah. I'm not sure what I can do about changing the banking rules in Russia.
What is your suggestion?
Well, the suggestion is change the rules. I mean, I don't see any logic in why somebody should need a guarantee when they have property or assets in their own name and in their own right. Any normal banker, whether they're Islamic or conventional, when they're looking to make a loan to somebody, will assess what is the likelihood of getting the money back. I mean, that's what it's about. And refer back to the point over there. And when you look at the assets somebody has, what they want to do with the money, what sort of cash flow they're going to generate from that, that's probably either a good transaction or a less good transaction. I mean, going back to what you were saying, I think, I probably shouldn't be saying this as a man, but gender stereotyping, one of the things is that women are normally assumed to be more risk averse than men. As a lending proposition, that's probably a very good thing, because you're probably less likely to go off and do something unlikely with the money, what you say you're going to do with the money. But maybe coming back to the other point about self-promotion, if you like, that becomes a negative issue of not taking chances when an opportunity is there. Again, the example earlier was, if I do a good job, someone will notice and then I'll get promoted, won't I? Well, maybe that might be true in a small environment and people will notice, but in a larger corporate culture, not necessarily. So you have to push yourself forward, promote yourself, not literally promote yourself, but push yourself forward and make it clear that you're very keen on whatever the next stage is. And I would suggest, in terms of the lending side, that the same sort of solution should be there. That if somebody owns assets and they've got a good business idea and it looks like it's going to pay back, that's exactly what most bankers are looking for.
Thank you, and I just want to share how they deal with that. They're just going and taking from credit cards and no access money from a bank. They're just going and taking from credit cards. That's the way, how they are dealing with it now.
I mean, the whole issue of barriers to that are in place preventing women and the issues around collateral. And the World Bank is really doing a lot of work in this area. And the Women Business and Law report, which I strongly recommend you look at, is for the first time beginning not just to document that across a number of countries, including the OIC, but I think very importantly providing evidence of what the barriers are. We often talk, yes, there are barriers, but let's actually see what is the impact of having certain kinds of collateral required to be in place, or barriers. And that actually is a very important initiative that they've been taking, and I think I encourage you to look at that. Just pick up on a point that you made about entrepreneurship, because I think it was very striking 2 or 3 years ago when, as involved in the Muslim Council of Britain, we took a very big delegation to the WIF, and it was in Malaysia in 2010. But that was the first time we took a very large US contingent with us as well. And of that contingent, probably half of the 60 people were women from the US. And it was very striking with the broad generalization, admittedly. There was a different kind of energy and drive coming from those women from the US in terms of entrepreneurship. And I just wonder whether, in terms of the UK or the other countries, is there a role for financial institutions or others in terms of helping, you talked about skills development, in terms of helping to encourage and embed that entrepreneurship?
Again, the short answer is yes, but it's easier to do in a larger organisation. There was, again, a question, I think it was to Boris Johnson, from a gentleman who may be in the audience, who was asking, why is it that if I want to get into Islamic banking, I have to go to conventional banking first? And I think, and Boris isn't a finance man, he's a politician and journalist, so he didn't ask the question, obviously. But I think the answer to the question is that it's not to do about Islamic or conventional. We're talking about the UK here. It's about the length or the age of the industry. So in time, people will be able to choose, and they will go straight into one or the other. And I'm sure in Malaysia that would be the case now. But at the moment, the Islamic banks are so small relative to the conventional, and they haven't been around long enough, that that sort of training process hasn't really gone through to fulfillment. But that is going to change over time, definitely.
More questions? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Janice Bond. I'm from the Inner City Muslim Action Network. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture in Chicago, Illinois. I heard a lot about the different opportunities and challenges, and of course, we're talking to the world network of individuals, so a lot of the processes will change tremendously from person to person. But I am interested in knowing if there are conversations that are happening in any direction that you're aware of strongly, that are educating both sides on how to meet in the middle. Because of course, being a banking institution, whether it's Islamic or not, you are a bank, and you're thinking about risk and return on investment, and growth and marketability, and a lot of different terms and concepts that may be somewhat foreign or very foreign to a woman or even anyone in a less developed area, but maybe something great that can go forward. And so I'm wondering if on their end, without having to invest in a finance or international business, collegiate or university education, are there programs that institutions like yourself are starting to link with in order to educate a woman that may have a business that at this time, may not be developed enough in order to be attractive for even some level of finance from an Islamic banking institution or even microfinance from another institution. But if they are aware of the criteria and the process and the proper teams to put in place to empower themselves to become more attractive, then perhaps they'd have a better shot. And then on the other side, educating different VCs or angels or different people that can make those introductions and mentor in order to just create a more transparent and sustainable ecosystem for all parties. Because I think part of the challenge is not so much even the lack of access, but the lack of knowledge of access that a lot of these women have, not just as far as career, but more so even those that may be more entrepreneurial. So if you could just speak to that.
I think there's a big issue around communication in that sense. I mean, the facilities to do exams or train or whatever are available if you know where to go and look. But then how do you know where to go and look? I mean, I think that social networking sites and the internet will make a big difference if somebody knows the right question to ask. And there are definitely networks of business angels, but I'm not sure there are any specific women particularly. but you're back to there's nothing that will stop a woman applying to that if you've got the right business idea. And I think very often a lot of small businesses, what they actually need is equity investment as opposed to borrowing from somebody. And finding access to that kind of thing requires a certain amount of knowledge, firstly of the different financing techniques, and secondly, who might you go to acquire those things, because it won't be the banks, it'll be different places, it'll be funds, it'll be government-backed entities, those kind of things. And I know there's a lot of work being done at the political level to know how that information could be got to the people who need it. But
right, and even understanding how viable your ideas are based on that particular market, because a woman may hear, or a particular business owner may hear the words, this is not fundable, or this may not work, but someone that has an institution, or if there was some sort of mentoring program that was available through these institutions, or some link to an organization that provides mentoring, they can help them in the way of like market adaptation and understanding that this particular product or service may not work well here, but just in the city, or an area 300 miles north or south or east or west, by just tweaking this just a bit, now you have a viable product or service. So I think that in addition to where, but the what and how is really going to link us in those ways. And I think that by supporting not only directly to business, but the institutions that are looking to mentor and build and support these women and their businesses to become stronger is something that should really be more institutionalized, perhaps.
Thank you. Can I just ask any more questions before we close? So, what I'll do at this stage is I'll take a round of questions together, a manageable number of questions together, and then we'll close off with some final comments from this end. So, I see one there, 2, 3. Okay, we'll go for those 3. So the first one right now.
Hi, my name's Zahir Nayami. I'm a lawyer specialising in Islamic finance and real estate. I'm quite a junior lawyer in that I've been qualified in just over a year. And I think this is a question for perhaps the gents and the ladies who find themselves coming outside of university, not only finding the graduate market difficult, but also perhaps even more so the Islamic finance scene, insofar as there are a limited number of windows and an even more limited number of fully Sharia compliant banks. I guess a question to Nigel would be, what, overall skills would you suggest to graduates looking for jobs in BLME or Gatehouse or other banks that could perhaps apply to everyone, not just the ladies? I guess that would include, conventional experience, but another sub-question would be, would you suggest, or is it admirable to get all of these extra IFQ qualifications, etc., that are available through master's degrees? So that's just...
Before we go on, the other question over here, we'll take that together. So skills in terms of getting into the industry, and over here, microphone's coming towards you. And one last question. Just in the middle over there.
My name is Mubaris. I'm from Tajikistan. My question is related, there are 2 questions. We're currently working on developing the first Islamic bank in Tajikistan. We've raised half of the funds so far, and we're currently looking to close the other. And part of the bank, we hope, will be encouragement of women entrepreneurship. And my question is, how do you see, if you have any experience in this, of promoting women entrepreneurship, particularly within the CIS region?
Okay, that's the CIS question. And then the last question down the way front, maybe in the second row. Microphone just on this side.
I'm Clementine Brown, the co-founder of the Oxford Islamic Banking and Finance Society. Kind of related to the question behind me, do you think, you're saying a lot of people come in from conventional finance like you did, that's the way they enter Islamic finance. Do you think there might be a drive to recruit people straight into places like the LME from universities with kind of graduate internship schemes and things like that?
Maybe I'll do the questions in reverse order if I can remember them. In terms of internships, we do run internships in terms of small, short-term periods of exposure to the business and so on. But as I mentioned, we've got 100 staff, so we can't exactly run programs and taking on 20 people each year like the big organisations can, because it just isn't physically possible. But as the businesses grow, I think developing the various training programs are a key part of what we're doing and developing our staff and so on. So that will happen over time. As we're sort of on training, the legal question, I think times are tough at the graduate level at the moment, but if you've qualified, you've probably already done the most difficult bit, because finding the training contracts is, I believe, the hardest bit right now.
I guess that question is more sort of general.
Yeah. In terms of how would you become a lawyer specialising in Islamic finance in an Islamic institution, I think you have to think a little bit laterally. I mean, the law is the same law, so that's not going to change. It's UK banking law is UK banking law. If you're very keen to work in an Islamic organisation, then you'd either possibly need to get into an Islamic organisation, but they're probably going to be too small for now. I would look at either going to one of the firms, and there's about 25 of them that specialise in Islamic finance, or trying to get into one of the larger banks that have an Islamic window, and or consider working in one of the Islamic countries, because there tends to be more demand for UK law graduates in other parts of the world. I mean, I'm not as familiar with Malaysia, but certainly the Middle East, there's a lot of demand for well-qualified people. And obviously that will get you into the Islamic space much more quickly. So I think there are a number of possible routes in, and it's a case of, as I mentioned, see how fate deals the cards and what you may end up and what opportunities may come up first. But I think I've looked down all those three different possible routes. I've left the most difficult one to last, so I have to say my familiarity with the CIS is fairly limited. I don't really know how you would, under that regulatory regime, do anything differently from anybody else. But my experience of trying to promote women entrepreneurs in the UK is if you get the communication out there, people will come to you. Some of the proposals will be great and some of them will be less great, but it's about getting the information out to the right people, and I think that can be done via different advertising channels and media channels, but finding people is usually not that difficult once you do that.
Right, well, if anybody ever said that the first session after lunch was a challenge, you proved the opposite. So it's probably been one of the best attended sessions. So the money is clearly in this space. And I'd just like to thank all of you for your very active participation. Nigel, very much for your contribution as well. And encourage you to stay with this topic and this issue. I mean, this is going to be not only the topic of the next session in this room. You heard this morning WIF is moving forward in its work in this area. And I think there's a lot of potential moving forward. So thank you very much for your attention.